Welcome everybody to Radical Anthropology Talks tonight. And again, we're Zoom only because our speaker, Dr. Valentina Zagaria, is speaking to us from Tunis, which is pretty amazing. And she's speaking on a subject which really Radical Anthropology should have had heard more already about, but we're very excited to hear about Valentina's fieldwork. Valentina is a postdoctoral fellow at the Central European University, as well as associate fellow in the Institut de Recherche sur le Maghreb contemporain in Tunis. And her fieldwork has been on political aspects of Libyan women's lives through long-term or intermittent exile in Tunisia. And she's really going to be talking about her PhD work, which she did at the LSE, tonight. And yeah, let me hand over to Valentina.
Thank you, Camilla. So I'll start sharing my screen. Fantastic. So thank you, Camilla and Chris, for inviting me to participate and speak today as part of the Radical Anthropology Talks on what it means to be human. And thank you also to Jonathan, who's not here, but who put us in touch. So this evening, I will be telling you about how revolution and movements across this, stretch of sea in the central Mediterranean are lived through the viewpoints of those coming from, living in, or passing through southeastern Tunisia. Here we go. So this talk draws, as Camilla said, from my PhD research, for which I carried out 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork in the southeastern Tunisian town of Zarzis from August 2015 to October 2017. The thesis is about the ways in which dignity, understood as an existential and a relational claim to respect and recognition, is the motor of both burning the border and of revolutionary demands. The term harga, meaning the burning, is used throughout North Africa to describe the crossing of the EU's Mediterranean Sea border and other borders without identity or travel documents. The chapters of the thesis focus on how different inhabitants of Zarzis, a peripheral town that is nevertheless enmeshed in global and regional power dynamics and inequalities, conceptualize and attempt to pursue a dignified life through migration in a politically and economically unstable context. They explore the ordinary experiences of irregularized migration of both border crossers and their families, neighborhoods, and communities in a post-revolutionary society where the demands of the revolution are yet to be addressed, and where many feel disenchanted at the prospect of change really coming about. Part of the ordinary in a Mediterranean coastal town such as Zarzis, located in the EU's buffer zone, is the finding and burial of persons who died on their journey to Europe. This research project thus shows the ways in which dignity is played out within families and in intimate social relations, as well as what dignifying the dead and the absent entails for the living. In what follows, I will take you through scenes from different life stories of people from different ages that I came to know well while living in Zarzis, as well as describing the recent history of how a local makeshift cemetery for unknown persons turned more permanent in order to address some lasting aspects of the unfolding of life and death at the European Union's border in North Africa. Mediterranean crossings will be shown to be deeply enmeshed with people's understandings of their own life course, the temporalities and gendered expectations linked to their life stages. The harga in Zarzis is often understood by young men to be the only way out of social death that is available to them, and can result in retrenching a conservative vision of social life and social reproduction in Zarzis. Many harga, border burners, explain their desire to migrate as necessary for reproducing a socially acceptable way of life and a dignified standard of living in their hometown. The harga, nevertheless, also allows for some gender roles to shift and for new caring communities and marriage patterns to emerge. The first half of today's talk focuses on this local notion of social death and what it means to live a dignified life, and on the effects that different migration and border policies have had on social and family relations in this emigrants' town. The second half focuses on the absences of sons and the presences of unknown border dead, and the ways in which the notions of dignity might be extended to non-citizens, bestowing them their place in Zarzis and expanding the baseline for collective livability and justice. So the harga has gone bad. Mid-afternoon, March 2017, Zarzis. Akri sat making red tea with her small coal stove on a thin floor mattress placed indoors on a thick carpet. Unlike in this photo, which instead portrays her summertime tea-making setup. Her husband, Bab el-Haj, was resting next to her, lying on an analogous mattress under several woolen blankets. I passed by their house for an afternoon visit with one of their grandsons, Lotfi, who had recently returned to Zarzis after 6 years of absence, having been expulsé, from the French word expulsé, meaning deported, from France. He had left at 18 as a harga, border burner, making the journey to Europe via sea without a visa in the immediate aftermath of the 2011 revolution. He had been living in Paris undocumented since, unable to travel back to Zarzis for visits. He was now dedicating as much time as possible to his grandparents and family, while trying to find a way to either make a living in the Bled, hometown, or to attempt the crossing once more. Lotfi's younger brother, Ghali, at the time 22, had gone to live in the capital, Tunis, with a couple of friends from the neighborhood 3 months earlier, with the aim of finding a way to get a boat to Italy. As soon as we sat down next to Akri, she inquired after Ghali. I want him to come back. He's intelligent, he's a good mechanic. If there is a possibility to do the harga within the next days, then so be it. But if not, he must come back. She remembered how living in France had been no easy feat for her husband and sons. All my sons are good. I praise them all. They are hardworking and they earn a lot of money. They are all abroad. But the harga is like something that's gone bad. El harga afna. Listen, it's better to spend 15 or 20,000 dinars to pay for the visa so that your son can leave Tunisia with his head high, rasu marfua. Otherwise, you will burn, and over there, your life will be burned. Enti harik والدنيا محروقة. But who will welcome you over there? What kind of work will you find? All my children had to do difficult work in the beginning. They suffered. They worked with the trucks, heavy machinery used for construction work. The man who built this house, her husband Bab el-Haj, worked hard day and night in France. It was dangerous. One of my children told me, Mother, I saw some people, if you return home carrying 2 loaves of bread, people take the bread by force. They tell you, we are hungry and you have money. Hundreds of thousands of people left Zarzis for France. Tilting her head in Lotfi's direction, she added, but tell me, isn't it better to work here for 20 dinars a day and you can rest at night with a full stomach without worrying? Moving her gaze back down to pour us tea, she concluded, Hiya harga ya kibdi, harga afna. This is the harga, my child. The harga is something that's gone off. Al harga sharga. The harga makes me choke. I can't swallow it. It goes down the wrong way. Harga sharga here is a play on words on the part of Akri, who enjoyed using her language creatively. Young men would often describe their determination to migrate by pointing out that they had nothing to lose, that they were already dead in Zarzis. Ya harga ya sharga, for them, meant that they either succeeded at the harga or they choked, drowned. Akri instead used the same combination of words to mean that the harga itself was something she felt choked by. She then went over an episode that had happened to Ghali some weeks before in Tunis. He had traveled there with 13,000 dinars that his brothers, some working in France, others in Zarzis, had helped him gather. Together with his friends, they thought they had found a solid lead for the crossing. After making arrangements with the smuggler, they had been put up in a house with several other men from different regions of Tunisia. The house looked fine from outside, but inside it was dirty and miserable. They were then betrayed by somebody, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps the smuggler himself, and the police came to take them. Some of the men had hidden all their money in their underwear. When their police could not find the money, they made them undress. Thankfully, Ghali had only taken part of the sum with him, leaving most of the amount with a friend in Tunis, who had been tasked to pay the smuggler only if he managed to get to Italy. This was a crucial reason why, in Akri's view, migrating to Europe had become an issue for her grandson's generation, compared to what migration had comprised for her husband, Bab el-Hajj, and for her sons, who had instead reached France on ships or planes. What was different with the harga was that, since it often involved underground arrangements, the misery began in Tunis, before even getting to Italy. As Akri put it, because of France, Ghali is mlawah, thrown away, tossed aside, like something without any value in Tunis. A dignified life. Remaining faithful to Akri's and other research participants' ways of expressing sentiments related to dignity, karama, and disdain, hogra, the thesis explores what being able to hold one head's high, ras marfu'a, and conversely, what being devalued, mlawah, entail in Zarzis for both people pursuing different migratory projects and for those who either decide against it or are unable to move. When I started fieldwork in the summer of 2015, Tunisia was working through its democratic transition, which constituted a temporal kind of in-between. Within the family sphere or one's neighborhood, people in Zarzis often expressed feeling mirtah, relaxed, calm, and in place, surrounded by people for whom they had value and whom they valued. Comfort and security were, however, the first two things that came to people's minds when asked about the difference between pre- and post-revolutionary periods. A lack of stability, ambient uncertainty, a considerable rise in the cost of living unmatched by people's salaries, terrorist attacks, curfews, and invocations of states of emergency, and a general sense of lack of safety and of lack of safety nets pervaded conversations on life beyond the revolution. A problematic aspect of continuity, however, between Ben Ali's rule and the current transition to democracy was that people in Zarzis and in many other peripheral regions did not feel mirtah, at ease, in their own country. Beyond one's neighborhood, one's town, the region, at national level, increasing possibilities emerged for being treated with disrespect, for feeling hogra, disdain, humiliation, for being made to feel dispensable, like rubbish thrown on the side of the road, mlawah, as Akri put it. So both karama, dignity, and hogra, disdain, disrespect, had come to be politicized by the revolution. Both are intersubjective sentiments that involve another person's or another agent's, such as the state, the police, the ruling class, actions towards oneself, whether the latter be conceived as an individual or as a collective. Work, freedom, and national dignity, karama wataniya, was one of the driving slogans and demands of the 2011 revolution, itself officially memorialized as the Revolution of Dignity and Freedom. This demand for collective dignity is also common to the revolts that ensued in other countries as part of the 2011 uprisings, for example, in Egypt, as well as to protests and campaigns emerging in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 global financial crisis in Southern Europe, for example, in Spain and Italy. In Tunisia, through these calls, dignity came to stand for the fundamental baseline of a decent life that Tunisians were being collectively denied. Karama Wataniya expressed a demand to be treated in a dignified way as a people, as a nation, by its rulers and the powers backing them. It was a collective sentiment that politicized those economic conditions that had been pushing Tunisians to run after the khobza, the bread, to use Hamza Mendeb's term, during Ben Ali's regime. Growing inequalities in Tunisian society, coupled with Ben Ali's attempts to appease the population's frustrations at a lack of freedom by pushing for consumption and propagating an image of economic growth, only exacerbated discontent. In many regions, citizens were having trouble making ends meet, feeling increasingly undignified in their own country, having to rely on contacts, patrons, and hand-me-downs to get by. The transition from the revolution to the construction of new institutions and ways of governing, including the writing of a new constitution and the devolution of more political power to municipalities and regions, involved questioning the content of the social contract with the state and what kind of society people wish to build out of the dictator's departure and the revolutionary impetus. The revolution itself was sparked by the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, a young informal street trader in the impoverished central Tunisian town of Sidi Bouzid. Bouazizi's had been a political act of protest, a suicide manifesto, in the words of Mehdi Mabrouk, resulting from yet another incident during which he had been devalued, despised, and humiliated by the police, the state, and society. The revolution also brought about new solidarities between different generations of Tunisians. The predicaments of the youth, who form a large part of the population, were finally publicly recognized, seen. Tunisians began vociferously acknowledging, protesting, and discussing the fact that unemployment and precarious labor conditions had excluded the youth from having a legitimate say, not just politically or within workers' unions, but within the family. Migration and the harga also started being more regularly and openly included within economic, social, and political mobilizations. Yet, while Tunisian citizens continued shaping these debates and struggles within their country, despite much disillusionment and disagreement, the European Union's migration management and border security paradigms remained constant in excluding the majority of Tunisian citizens' access to dignified travel to and life in Europe. It is within this climate of change, uncertainty, and injustice that this thesis is situated, tracing different ways in which struggles, demands, but also intimate, quotidian, and familial feelings of being valued and devalued play out in a coastal town made by variously entangled geographical and temporal in-betweens. Pursuing dignity via the harga, a different but no less political kind of burning carried out, in the words of many harga burners, for similar reasons to the ones that led to Bouazizi's suicide manifesto. I just want to ask, before carrying on, whether you can see me or whether you can only see Chris's window here, and whether I should do anything about it.
I can see you.
Yes? Okay, sorry. So then
we can see you fine, yes.
So now that I've tucked away, the little image, it doesn't make any difference?
I can still see you, and I want to see you, to be honest. It's much better.
I think it's fine. The recording will pick, I think the recording will pick you up.
Fantastic, because I could only see Chris, and now I can see Camilla's background. So I just wanted to make sure that.
I think we're good.
Great, I'll carry on then. So now I'm moving on to another aspect of my thesis, which has to do with dignifying the dead. Every Muslim knows how to wash the dead theoretically, because the steps resemble those of ablutions before the 5 daily prayers. But in practice, it's a different thing. Walid, a cousin who lived 2 houses down from ours with his wife and 3 small children, was the only man in the extended family who was experienced in caring for the dead properly. He was one of the few men in the Huma neighborhood who was called upon when somebody passed away to prepare the deceased's body for the funeral and burial, usually taking place on the same day as the death. Before deciding to move back to Zarzis, Walid had lived in France for several years, where he had, in his words, lost his way. The physical trace this period left on Walid was the loss of his left eye due to an accident caused by a night of heavy drinking. Since returning to Zarzis, he had taken to praying more regularly and had slowly turned to a more conservative religious lifestyle. He explained that washing the dead pleases God, and that it was for him a privilege to be the one people called for the task. Before starting, one must set one's intention. You are doing this for God. It is not for money. It is not a job. The person who washes the body must also protect the secrets of the dead. The secrets of the body, and so of the dead, are not to be shared with anyone, as that would amount to a betrayal of the dead person, which would displease God. If in washing the dead, a secret reveals itself about their past life, the secret is buried with the dead. Reflecting on his role, he explained, not everyone can deal with being so close to corpses, although in principle, everyone should be able to. Death is not something to be afraid of. With regards to the unknown persons who die at sea on their ways to Italy, and whose bodies are found and buried in Zarzis, Walid felt that the conditions in which they were buried was not dignified. It was the first time he was hearing about it, when we spoke about it, and asked me several times if I was sure about the information. He reasoned, however, that at least the sea washes the dead, and so there would be no need to wash them again before burial. After some thought, he added, if someone dies at sea, God could consider them a martyr, and they could go straight to heaven. Rida sat on a plastic chair under his biggest fig tree, and as his 3-year-old grandson Saber, named after his disappeared son, ran around in the sand. Like several other fishermen from Zarzis, he had recently gone to Bengerden, the neighboring town, to get the cartilage of his left ear pierced with a copper ring by a Chinese doctor, the latest of promised remedies for the sciatica that most seafarers suffered from sooner or later. Quote, Saber didn't want to be a fisherman. He didn't like it. He wanted an easier job. He couldn't handle hard work. He left school at 15, worked for a while at sea, but not with me. He worked on bigger fishing boats at the port. He didn't earn a lot of money. He wanted to buy clothes and shoes, but he didn't make enough money. He wanted to buy fancy clothes like his peers. He left with other friends from the neighborhood. After a brief pause, Rida sighed. What can you do? Harga sharga. Either we drown or we burn. Echoing the words of his son and his friends, tinting them with his own sense of powerlessness and grief at what had happened. Saber was 23 in February 2011 and had not told his father he was going to do the harga. Rida would have been against it. He believed that young men should not be leaving in that way because it was too dangerous and the authorities should not allow it to happen. But in 2011, right after the revolution, what was left of the authorities in Tunisia were unable, or perhaps also unwilling, to guard its coasts on behalf of the EU. And so especially young men started embarking to Italy in big numbers from Zarzis and other coastal towns. Most arrived safely, as in Zarzis, the organizers took care to only let the harraga leave on sturdy boats and to not overcrowd them, as those on board were Auledna, our sons. Saber's vessel's bad luck had been to have encountered at sea a Tunisian military ship returning from Lampedusa, Italy's southernmost island, with other harraga that Italy had managed to make them repatriate. Its captain, determined to stop these new harraga too, crashed into their wooden boat and sunk it. Beyond the specificities of this case, for which Rida and the other families are still seeking justice, Rida maintained that the sea is in itself a dangerous option. It devours Yekil people. And he would know, having worked his whole life off the swampy beach of Lemsa. Lemsa is the name of a long stretch of deserted marshland on the road heading south out of Zarzis city center in the direction of Benguertin, the last Tunisian town before Libya. The few vertical interruptions to the landscape's flatness are dry palm leaf huts built by fishermen for shade. On closer inspection, though, the beach is crowded with remains washed up from the sea, as the currents are particularly strong here. Mounds of brown algae, turtle shells, plastic shells, shoes, clothes, wood, oil tanks, water bottles. The bodies of deceased persons, or just limbs or parts, are also sometimes found here. Quote, "Last year, I was there in Lemsa, and I found 2 corpses of Black people. The municipality came and took them away. We called them on the phone. They were probably from Senegal or Mali. There are lots of bodies on the shores of Zarzis." Rida went on to talk about a survivor from Niger who had been found 15 days earlier near Benguertin, close to the port of El-Kitif. Rida had heard about him on the radio. Everyone else on that boat had died, around 120 people. They had left from Libya. He remembered that 4 years ago, with other fishermen, he had found a sunken Tunisian boat, which they figured must have left from Sfax, a Tunisian city further north with an important port and a long stretch of coast from which departures of Tunisians are often still happening, and shipwrecked on its way to Sicily. As he got up and scanned the tree for ripe figs for us to taste, his thoughts returned to Saber. People who were with him on the boat and were picked up in Sfax saw him dying. He was dead. Only Allah knows where his body is right now. It could be in Italy, Malta. Only Allah knows. I think about him all the time. Each time I go to sea, I think of him. The clandestine cemetery. Leaving the port behind, head south. Keep to the main road as it advances, flat and straight in the direction of Libya. The 2-story houses, abandoned construction sites, and busy commerce characteristic of the centre-ville gradually become more scattered, allowing glimpses of sea to the left and desert to the right. Watch out for the 8-kilometer marker, then turn right at the alcohol depot and the new football stadium. Drive along the side of the stadium, past graffiti praising the much-loved Espérance de Zarzis team. Once to the back of it, take the first dirt path snaking through mounds of sand and rubbish. From here on, there is no signposting. The only vehicles you might meet as you negotiate this narrow off-piste route are those of petrol smugglers carrying their barrels back from Libya, or of farmers driving their tractors back from the olive groves. They will most likely be unable to help you with the directions. Eventually, 2 imposing brick pillars appear in the distance. Park next to them. You have arrived. The bumpy terrain in front of the columns is a burial site hosting the bodies and human remains of unknown persons who died in the Mediterranean Sea while on their way to Europe. It came to be located in this isolated area known as Al-Gataya, on land which previously served as a garbage dump because, according to local authorities, it was the only plot that they could devote to the task. The municipality of Zarzis does not own much land within its catchment area, and since the bodies are usually found by fishermen close to Al-Gataya on the swampy beaches of Lemsa, which we just saw, this patch of land seemed to be a convenient choice. In 2006, the local authorities bought this land from the Ministry of the Environment, since by then another site was being used for waste disposal, and repurposed it into a makeshift cemetery. This location was selected despite it being a sebha, a marsh, and so particularly unsuitable for providing a stable resting ground for the dead. The cemetery is not signed, nor is it enclosed by a fence, and the two brick pillars that have become essential for identifying its location have in fact nothing to do with it, their purpose being to mark the entrance to a neighboring private property. If a visitor were to go look for the cemetery unaccompanied by someone who knows where to go, it would be difficult to find, as it is visually indistinguishable from the continuum of olive trees and rubbish that surround it. Yet this solution had only been envisaged as temporary. In the words of a municipality employee, this is a clandestine cemetery. No official papers were ever produced to convert the plot of land into a cemetery, and it doesn't feature as a cemetery in the town's urban planning cartography. And it is not clear whether the municipality holds any records of the number of persons who have been buried there over the years. When the first unknown dead were starting to be found near the shores of Zarzis some 20 years ago, coinciding with the strengthening of the Schengen zone in the EU, and thus with the simultaneous abolition of internal EU borders and the imposition of ever stricter visa regimes on non-EU citizens, local authorities buried them in the cemetery closest to the centre-ville, the Jabal al-Azraq. That cemetery, however, is not the town's main cemetery. Like all of the innumerable other cemeteries characterizing the geography of Zarzis, it is a family and neighborhood-run cemetery. The municipality therefore had trouble burying unknown persons there, and ultimately had to resort to burying them in the remote ground in Al-Gattaya. The management of the dead in Zarzis, like in many other Tunisian towns, is not centralized in any one or select few cemeteries, and it is not municipality run. Each family and neighborhood has its own cemetery built on land originally donated by the close-knit community by wealthier landowning members as religiously motivated charity. While in Zarzis, these land donations have recently been formalized and registered as public municipal domain, if you were to ask the municipality for the total number of cemeteries in Zarzis, they would be unsure of the answer and would have to refer to town planning maps to count them one by one. Similarly, if you were to ask the municipality for the exact placement of a deceased person in a specific cemetery, they would not be able to provide you with this information, since they do not produce documents attesting to the allocation of burial spots. In fact, burial plots cannot be bought and sold, as they are in some parts of the world where the state has taken over the management of death, therefore often commercializing it. And there is no predetermined plot designation. Deceased persons are buried in the ground, one after the other, in the order of death, in succeeding horizontal rows. Thus, the municipality's role in the burial of its citizens to this day, despite the government passing laws to gain more control over both the land and the organization of cemeteries, is restricted to providing them with death certificates and burial permits. It is the family of the deceased who take care of digging the grave and contributing to the maintenance of their local cemetery, and who also guard the knowledge and memory of who has been laid to rest where. The Jabal al-Azraq's location next to the city center made it seem like a more intuitively municipal cemetery as compared to the others, yet this association relied on specific historical developments that had not translated into a change in people's relation to the cemetery. Under French colonial rule, Zarzis played an important role due to its port and strategic position close to the Italian-ruled Libya. The French had thus settled close to the port and had built military barracks, French gender-segregated schools, and a Christian cemetery next to the existing Al-Azraq Muslim cemetery and the adjacent Jewish cemetery, the Jewish community having historically resided in this part of town. As a result, the neighborhood developed into what is now known as the centre-ville of Zarzis. Prior to French rule, though, Zarzis was neither considered nor inhabited as a city, but more as an area populated by small villages closely connected through trade and kinship. The city of Zarzis developed in the absence of both a particular vision of town planning and of a will to centralize the management of death. Its inhabitants have continued burying their death themselves in small family and neighborhood-run cemeteries, and the municipality has continued to have little to do with death matters. As a result, when the victims of the EU border regime began to be found on the coast near Zarzis, the legitimacy of the municipality's decision to bury them in the Jebel al-Azraq was open to contestation. The old rubbish dump site later emerged as a temporary last resort solution. So, some conclusions from these separate scenes of life and death in Zarzis. The concept of social death has often been used as an analytical tool in extreme situations of coercion and injustice, such as the transatlantic slave trade or occupied Palestine. It is thus important to qualify this rhetoric by noting that social death in Zarzis was nothing like that of the slaves that Patterson was describing when he coined the term, much less the very specific experiences of African-American women under chattel slavery documented by Hartman, that later became central to Mbembe's notion of necropolitics. It is also crucial to remember that actual death during migratory journeys is unequally distributed within Africa, within Tunisia, and within Zarzis. The inhabitants of this coastal town know this all too well, since the Mediterranean is a liquid border, inconsistently liable to bring back to shore those who died on the crossing. However, it is precisely because the European Union's border regime pushes people to embark on ever more dangerous, deadly journeys that it is important to understand how it also amplifies possibilities for social death in countries of departure. Social death in Zarzis is not solely a result of global inequalities and documented mobility restrictions, but the risk of becoming socially dead has become more salient as a result. The feeling of being already dead that young people in Zarzis evoked is closer to the boredom and despair identified by Shilke in Egypt, and similarly felt in both other North African countries and in those countries undergoing economic crisis, also neighboring the EU, that are likewise constrained by its mobility restrictions, such as the entrapment felt, for example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbia, described by Janssen. In Zarzis, as in these settings, there is a sense of systemic injustice that makes young men's search for a dignified life an urgent and irrepressible one. But there are additional factors too, the ordinary constraints which relate to a generalized condition of life under neoliberalism and capitalism. Although the possibilities available to young men in Zarzis are broader and their mobility much less restricted than that of Palestinians under Israeli military occupation, this generalized feeling still remains the baseline of Hage's definition of social death as the impossibility of making a life, and even of an inability to dream a meaningful life. Weiss' description of young men in Guinea-Bissau's capital Bissau, whose chances of social becoming and of escaping social death can only be realized by either making themselves absent via migration or by engaging in armed conflict, also resonates, although again, in much less extreme ways. In Zarzis, there is a widespread sense that the only way to realize oneself and avoid social death in the bled, hometown, meaning both hometown and country, is by leaving it. Social death here is an ethnographic term employed by aspiring harga to explain their motivations to leave. They are already socially dead, so they might as well risk physical death in order to start living on the other side of the sea and eventually be able to construct a dignified life back home. A dignified life thus becomes the baseline for leading a decent life, while social death is understood to comprise prolonged and potentially eternal stuckness, a life of just making do, making ends meet, or running after the bread, without being able to move through the normal, socially valued life stages that make up the good life in Zarzis. The thesis thus wishes to counter misconceptions about migration, often framed solely as a problem of integration in the European Union, by showing how the harga, from the point of view of its protagonists, who in this ethnography are both the young men who undertake it and the families, neighborhoods, and communities who make it possible and whose social death is also at stake. It's in fact about attaining and reproducing a dignified life back home. Dignity as a drive for the harga and as a political revolutionary claim is sustained by ambivalent structures of feeling that uphold it as an aspiration while revealing the moral uneasiness both migrants and stayers hold about having to leave in order to attain dignified futures that resemble those cherished by parents and grandparents in the blood. What is at stake, therefore, in embarking on migration projects is also the social reproduction of Zarzis. Yet the coming and going circular migration between Tunisia and Europe that had been available to older generations of migrants is no longer possible in the aftermath of the creation of the EU's Schengen zone in the 1990s. The movement from Zarzis to Paris, the most coveted destination, is now non-reversible. It is not circular. Legal and infrastructure changes in European border politics had substantial social implications for kinship and social relations in Zarzis. Inhabitants are now having to operate in the face of social fragmentation and more prolonged absences of loved ones, who at times go missing indefinitely. Pursuing dignity via migration to Europe thus folds into the question of change for those who feel they belong to Zarzis. The discontent voiced by young men about their lives contains an element of nostalgia for the good, dignified life that they perceive their parents and grandparents to have been able to lead, but which is no longer available as an option, and perhaps, following Derrida's notion of nostalgia, never was in fact achievable. It is impossible for them to recreate that social formation, which nevertheless remains desired, in which they foreground as a motive for burning. The thesis thus records a historical change, as gender relations and family dynamics are altered locally in Zarzis by recent legal and technical changes to the EU border. The question of the rights, dignity, and place of non-citizens in Tunisia, whether they be living or deceased, has also come to the fore since the 2011 revolution. French retirees living in southeastern Tunisia are occupying a very different place as guests with certain abilities to stake claims to the territory compared to the citizens of other African countries fleeing war in nearby Libya and ending up in Zarzis. Retirees are located legally and socially in Zarzis, and so the ways in which their bodies are treated after death is also completely different from the fate of the bodies of unknown migrants found on its shores. The border dead have neither social nor territorial connections to the people who bury them. Procedures to return these dead are not activated, while they are for elderly Europeans living out their retirement in Zarzis. The relationship between the law and territoriality therefore emerges as fundamental in determining these cases, since in the absence of social and territorial ties, the unknown migrant dead fall into a black hole, while locals are left to do what they can to make their burials dignified and their presence visible. The human body is not just an object, and yet it seems difficult to know what to do in Zarzis to find a solution to the border dead in the absence of a higher form of authority able or willing to step in. In Zarzis, it is the family that takes over and becomes the institution governing death matters. The weight of responsibility for the dead falling on families results, however, in being an even more exclusionary process. Relations of care among kin are, of course, also relations of domination, as care generates entitlements, sort of property in people. Care and social reproduction can indeed be conservative platforms as well. A revolutionary question, therefore, might be, if pursuing dignity via the burning of unjust, deadly borders could entail a fairer, more inclusive, and more human approach to social reproduction, then what could it be the social reproduction of? And could a different approach to citizenship from below, beyond state laws and institutions, recognize and dignify a place for others? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina. That's so moving and thought-provoking, and it's something that is so important for people in Europe to viewing this situation and the drastic, people in Brexit Britain viewing the drastic journeys that are undertaken by people coming across the English Channel to understand what is the perspective from the viewpoint from Tunisian. Can I invite anybody, any questions or thoughts or comments for Valentina? There's a lot here.
Well, perhaps just Valentina, to start off, I can obviously you focus almost entirely on young men for the simple reason that it tends to be young men who feel the need to to risk crossing. But perhaps could you say a little bit more about the young women, just and how they're feeling about all this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. So I was actually wondering whether to, on top of the vignette, it's so difficult. I've not touched the thesis in about a year, and it's been really tough to go back to it and try to summarize what it could all be about, and choose the vignettes and not make it too anthropological. But I was actually wondering whether to open with another vignette, which is the basis of my third chapter, and which is about a young woman who's just divorced her husband and has 2 young children, and is wondering whether she will do the crossing as well. It is definitely the case that in Tunisia, as in other North African countries, women are doing the crossing more and more, and so are families, especially over the past 2 years with the additional hardships brought about by the pandemic. Generally speaking, women tend to have an easier time getting visas to travel to France, and places like Zarzis, where so many people have cousins, uncles, family members abroad, women tend to get an invitation and a visa invitation for a tourist visa, and generally are accepted more frequently. Also, it's seen as additionally difficult for a woman to board a boat full of men. So women do tend to do it less, but more and more are also doing it. But more generally, young women are often actually blamed by younger and older men for being the cause of the harga to begin with. So a lot of my PhD looks at the moral anxieties and accusations that occur in Zarzis related to the harga. And so young women are often accused of wanting extravagant lifestyles and of wanting huge weddings. And so that's why young men feel like they have to go, because otherwise they can't reproduce the household and they can't get married. While talking to young women, I guess, is a whole other story. But yeah, I mean, some definitely do also want to leave, but some don't. And yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Anybody else with some queries? And the revolutionary call you have at the end is really demanding, the taking down of fortress Europe and Schengen, which I mean any human being with sense can understand, because there was a natural a kind of normal life history circulation of young people going to France and then coming back to stay and live in Tunisia and build Tunisia's societies. So what is this absolute brutality that is creating a wall of death and creating this completely impossible, is these young men facing this impossible task, as you say. It's just terrible.
Yeah, absolutely, Camilla. I think on the one hand, it's it's trying to center migration and the possibility to lead one's life however one wishes and travel abroad, and not necessarily have to also cave to the social reproduction of Zarzis and of these rather sort of strict patriarchal ways of imagining the family. So part of what the revolution sort of allowed for were discussions around what are we leaving for, how are we leaving, why are we leaving in this way, and the difficulty and almost stuckness that especially Tunisian activists involved in migration struggles face, is the fact that despite the country having undergone massive political change and the possibility, the political imaginaries having opened up, the context within which Tunisia exists hasn't changed. And so also the degree to which some of the revolutionary demands can be pushed through, especially regarding people's abilities to move, but also the rights of non-Tunisians in Tunisia. So the rights of others who end up either fleeing Libya and living temporarily in Zarzis, or who make the same crossing as young Tunisians. The rights of those people in Tunisia also is completely stuck, so and doesn't advance. It's a sort of deadlock, a complete deadlock that the country is in, unfortunately.
Could you perhaps say something about your academic context? I mean, who's supervising you? What support are you getting? What advice? What other researchers are doing work in comparable areas? That would be quite interesting for us as well.
Yes, absolutely. Should I reply, or should I wait for a couple of?
Well, I don't know.
Well, Ahmed had a question. Maybe do you want to speak, Ahmed, and then come back?
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Valentina, for the presentation. I'm also a CU student. I'm in the sociology department. So I'm interested in this subject, and I also wanted to add that the victims of the visa regime and border regime, not only hargas, but also ordinary young Tunisian people who have degrees and who want to study in France or abroad in generally. They always stuck in the visa process, and recently Macron announced a new regulation to decrease Tunisia's visa quota. So I started my academic year in Austria online, and I'm still stuck in Tunis because the visa process took a lot of time. So I'm wondering to Valentina and to all participants, how do you think academic work could influence the European policy on visa and borders? How could we contribute to change, to animate a public debate about these issues? Because usually in the West, they're not really aware about it. Or that's how I see it. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ahmed. So, I mean, firstly, how could academic work? I mean, definitely academic work coming from scholars such as yourself, who are not just Europeans such as me writing about North Africa, but who are writing about issues that you yourself are living, are very important. So something that someone like me could and should do is trying to amplify work being done by by North African and African scholars more generally when it comes to the Mediterranean and the visa blockages. But then another thing that I just wanted to pick up on that you were talking about. So it struck me that you said that also ordinary Tunisians and not just the harga are having trouble with visas. And this kind of conception as the harga as a young man who dropped out of school, who has no social capital, who has no education, who has no skills, and is going for skillless labor, is also something to combat, both in Tunisia itself and in Europe.
Yeah, I know, but you know, speaking English is not, doesn't always have,
sure.
It's also choose the right word, but I didn't mean they're not ordinary. But also, I mean, in the eyes of a foreigner to the subject, for example, he sees that it's a superhuman, that one crossing border by sea. But I mean, ordinary, like a normal person like me, or my friend Ali Knis is also from Zarzis, sorry to name it, but he's doing his master's in Paris 8 and he's still waiting for the visa for 2 years. So this issue is really a big issue.
Exactly. Yeah, no, sorry, Ahmed, I didn't mean to say that you don't believe it, but I just picked up on it because I think there is also a way in which under the Ben Ali regime, harraga were painted as criminals, and as they're either doing closharat and zatla in Tunis, or they're taking a boat and going to Europe. And it's incredible how many Tunisian friends who live in Tunis have unconsciously reproduced this image of border crossers and of the desires of people who don't have degrees for mobility as somehow suspicious and criminal and dubious. Yeah, but you're absolutely right in pointing out that actually a huge amount of people who cross the border and resort to the harga have degrees, are diplômés chômeurs, which was a huge revolutionary movement as well in 2011. So the unemployed people with undergraduate and master's degrees were just waiting for jobs to materialize. So yeah, I really hope you get your visa, Ahmed. I'm not in Vienna either, by the way, and it's only become more awful with this pandemic.
Are you going to answer my question?
Yeah, sorry, Chris. Yes, so I guess as a segue to what Ahmed brought up too, in Tunisia, border studies and migration studies has definitely been and is continuing to become a very strong field. And there is a ton of Tunisian scholars who are working on the subject from very different points of view. So there's the work of Wael Garnawi, who I would definitely recommend, who's a psychologist and who works with both harraga and with young Tunisians who have been and not so young, who have gone to fight for Daesh or who've been radicalized. And he also worked as a psychologist with people fleeing Libya and with mothers of missing harraga too. So his work is really interesting. And then there's the work of Hassan Boubakri as well, who's at the University of Sfax. There's a project going on to set up a border studies unit at the University of Sousse. And there are plenty more. On revolution, there's the work of Leila Dakhli and Amina Lal, which is really impressive. Jocelyne Dakhlia has written beautifully about the revolution and really in such depth. So these are just a couple of names of Tunisian scholars, either based in Tunisia or based mostly in France, some of them. And my supervisor, Saad LSE, there was nobody at all working on North Africa, sadly, because there's also this very skewed division of kind of colonial, neo-colonial, post-colonial areas. So the UK does India and whatever, and all these other places that are Anglophone, and the Maghreb is very much inhabited by North African and French-speaking scholars. So I worked with Deborah James and Matthias Pelkmans, who are fantastic, who work on South Africa and Georgia and post-socialist contexts, but on borders and migration. Yes, but yeah, so there is also definitely something to be said about the language in which we were able to write about Tunisia, and the places as well. So despite being very much, I mean, I'm Italian, so it's very much a neighboring country. Somehow it's only very recently that more and more Italian scholars, for instance, or scholars that aren't just French, have started working on Tunisia. It's a small circle.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Lieta, can you hear?
Hi, everybody. Hi. It was a really amazing, very moving, I nearly cried, talk. So thank you very much, Valentina. It was very poignant. The focus that you used made me think more than anything else on, I mean, you focused, of course, on a particular area, but of increasing kind of biopolitical measures that are used all over the world to control anything from, access to care, access to education, access to just about everything, and you kind of, your focus was on the very basic idea of a dignified life before, you get education and care. But this is also, what drives the rhetoric, and the language that is used, and the whole thing that you were talking about, that it's even reproduced in Tunisia, of the skillless laborer that, has no aspiration and just wants to basically cop out and go and find and do something else. Being Italian, this touched me really. I mean, I live in the UK, but it touched me very much. And I was wondering, partly you answered already, about comparable work that is being done on the other side, where also the rhetoric is being, is being reproduced by people in Italy who as well have, that have no jobs and really have no dignified life in terms of, they are very often, I talk to a lot of young people who consider themselves socially dead. They're nearly 30, they live with their parents, they have no way of buying a house or finding a job. And they, of course, reproduce this rhetoric. So partly, I'm really interested about other, comparable work being done in Italy. The second point, I was really interested in the focus of the research being dignity, because so much, because of biopolitical reasons, the focus is always on socio-economical kind of context, which also drives the rhetoric. And it brings me back to research that was done by the 3 Million, which is an organization in Britain that looks after, basically is a lobby for Europeans, post-Brexit Europeans like me. And they did a huge piece of research with the University of Strathclyde on specifically on identity and sense of belonging and ideas of representation and vulnerability that was, that was brought about by Brexit. So they also started focusing not so much on, what jobs can you get and can you not get, but also, how do you actually feel? Do you, do you feel that you belong? Do you feel that maybe you belong to a city, but actually the country that you've lived in for 28 years, like me, doesn't want you anymore? So issues, again, as I said, so they focus on this more, I don't know how to call them, but more experiential, phenomenological sort of and psychological sort of points of view, rather than the usual, money and can I go to a hospital and not have to pay kind of thing. So, if you haven't seen that research, I can post it in the chat. It's really, really interesting. Like you have a lot of vignettes from a lot of people. And I was very grateful that you brought the vignettes in, because again, the language that we use to talk about our experiences are very, very important. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Amazing, Lieta. Thank you so much. Yeah, that would be amazing if you could post it in the comments. I'd love to know more about this research project. And yes, absolutely, as you say, the commonalities with what has been happening especially in Southern Europe, but in a ton of other places. Like I guess that was my kind of point at the end when I talked a bit about social death and how it links to both much more extreme situations of social death, but also more ordinary and perhaps relatable for people like us coming from Italy, but also from all sorts of other places in Europe. Yeah, and that would be revolutionary too, if people could somehow connect on that level. Yeah, rather than sadly these rhetorics that are at times very, very powerful of rejection and of if you're in need and if you feel you're socially dead and your life is undignified, don't blame the government, blame other people for it. So this is the rhetoric to subvert and completely scratch somehow. Yeah, but yes, I absolutely think that by sort of remodel, and yes, and it is absolutely alive and kicking in Tunisia too. So it's not like in Tunisia the upper classes or the middle classes are understanding necessarily. Like there is a lot of social conflict and blame games floating around with who gives Tunisians a bad name in France. Second generation and third generation families in France often don't necessarily feel in solidarity with newcomers either. So there's all sorts of grounds to sort of.
And the so-called expats on the ground, because they're of course not immigrants, they're expats.
Yes. So I mean, yeah, absolutely. But thank you, Liat. A lot of food for thought. I see that
we have a chat question from Sinibaldo, and says they can't talk on the camera because of connection. Very great to learn about your work listening today after meeting you 2 years ago during a performance ethnography workshop at UCL. You're a theatre maker, and this was somehow part of your research in Tunisia. Could you tell something about that? I think it'd be interesting for others to learn. Thank you so much. Yeah, I wanted to know about that as well. So please tell us.
So Sinibaldo, I'm sad that I don't see your face, but thank you so much for having been here tonight and for the question. So I actually, yes, so I also do some theater. I trained in physical theater in Paris before embarking on this PhD journey. And with the theater company that we created with some other members of the Lecoq theater school that I was in, we did a performance called Miracoli, based on my master's fieldwork in Lampedusa, on this Italian border island, and based on collective research, fieldwork and performance research that we carried out on the island. And the idea was to experiment with ways of doing research, ethnographic research with theater. So ways of being with people, going to different places and being part of life at different times of the day, but also feeding back our observations through physical theater. So mute with no words, but we would be, we'd go out in Lampedusa on the main street in Via Roma and perform bits of observations back to people and see what their reactions were. And see if they got what we were trying to say by portraying them. And that was kind of an experiment. And then we created a whole theater show, which we brought back to Lampedusa in 2014. And that was a way also of kind of inscribing ethnographic research in something other than the written word and film, which are the more conventional, I guess, ways of giving back ethnography. But unfortunately, so in Tunisia with Theatre Senza, we did do ethnographic performative research in Tunis, in the neighborhood of the Hafsiya, on feelings of fear. So we worked in the public space and created a walk in the Medina of Tunis, together with different inhabitants of different ages, who allowed us to go into their corners of their houses, use their electricity, and who were either walking their dogs at a particular time, or handing out pieces of paper to audience members, or sitting with them and having a tea. But unfortunately in Zarzis, I somehow didn't manage. I just felt there was too much to do. I had to, first of all, try and learn Arabic as much as possible. And then I just felt like I didn't have a solid understanding of what was going on to be able to put myself out there and use theater as part of the research. So unfortunately in Zarzis itself, I didn't manage, but my next project will hopefully bring theater back. So my next sort of project that Camilla spoke about briefly is with the Libyan community, living temporarily on and off, or more permanently in Tunisia. And I'm aiming to do research on the border, so close to Zarzis, but more inland towards Tataouine and Bingerden, where there's lots of different families who have family in Libya and family in Tunisia. And I'm hoping to work especially with women and integrate theater in that, but it's all slightly, it's a projection. It's an aspiration.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah. So, yeah. How were people in Lampedusa and Tunis responding to this enactment? Can you say a bit more about it?
Yes.
How are they responding to being ethnographically observed? How was that in terms of a kind of participant observation?
Yeah, good question, Camilla. So in Lampedusa, we had a much longer experimental sort of giving people back phase. So we did both street theater with children, because children in Lampedusa are very much the owners of the streets.
Yeah.
So we did that, and that helped us sort of become kind of part of the summer scenery of strange foreigners interested in the island who descend upon the island regularly. And the performances that we're trying to give back, our observations, they really stemmed from my discomfort at the fact that it's true that as anthropologists, we're supposed to always remind people that we're taking notes of what's happening in our daily lives. And so we do that, but then it's also kind of difficult to really let people know what we're observing, and to really let them know what kind of moods we're capturing, what kind of emotions we feel were relevant, what kinds of encounters marked us. So there is a level to which we try to let people know that the research isn't only interviews, but is mostly living and taking notes about it. But then those notes remain very hidden. And I've always felt slightly uncomfortable about my notes and about the fact that I'm not able to kind of express what I found important and have people be conscious, for one, that that's what I'm doing, but also be able to tell me their points of view. So yeah, so it was interesting to do it through theater, because it's a whole other medium that can transmit definitely auras and impressions and feelings in different ways. So yes, it was interesting, but also we did it through mime. So we were basically looping scenes that we'd witnessed, and we were just telling people, these are things we've witnessed. Can you guess where they are, who the characters are, what's happening? And so it also worked as a sort of research method, because we found out, for example, that the children that we were working with every day had no idea what the migrant center really looked like, which is very hidden. It's in the inland of of the island, and we were miming people throwing clothes on very high on a net, because that's how they're drying clothes, on the net that kind of encloses the center. And it took a while for children to guess what we were miming. And then it led to interesting conversations about why are people drying their clothes that way, and the fact that they hadn't really been to see. They don't happen to stumble upon it, and there's it's a really dead end road, the road to the migrant center in Lampedusa. But yeah, and in Tunis it was much more participative than it was a completely different process, whereby we had less research time, but the performance itself was in the streets, the final performance. So it was participative in a very different way, because we weren't playing things back to people, but they were integral to the show itself.
Oh, yeah. It's fascinating. It's beautiful. And there's a question from Ian here, but Ian, you can't talk, I think, who's asking about the link, which I think you were making, between the concept of burning the border and how that associates with Mohamed Bouazizi's final revolutionary act. I mean, this burning is such a powerful metaphor.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if you can say.
Yeah, so I guess the Suicide Manifesto and Bouazizi's self-immolation kind of became recognized as the ignition, not just of the Tunisian revolution, but almost of the whole of the 2011 uprisings and revolution in North Africa and in the MENA region. And it immediately became understood as political, and as collective, as some sort of representing or standing for a collective grief and plight and desperation and call for change in a way. While often, I guess it links back to things we were talking about earlier in the discussion, often the harga is talked about by the media, by politicians, and sort of in general as a choice, as young men just making this choice and taking the boat, and it's an individual choice, and the families are pushing them. So there's also a lot of rhetoric of mothers and, as I said before, wives to be pushing young men to leave, and mothers selling their jewelry and financing the harga. And just there's a lot of blaming and shaming going on, especially when things go bad and when catastrophes happen and shipwrecks happen. Sort of the thing you hear a lot is sort of, why did these people decide to leave in this way? What are these poor choices that they're making? The scale is brought back very much to individuals making poor choices, instead of viewing the movement that is the burning of borders as a political act as well, and as stemming from structural and systemic injustices. Yeah, so yes, so I was kind of making this parallel, not just because, of course, it's sort of different ways of burning. Yeah. And definitely the metaphor of fire is very much there. The metaphor and the reality for, of course, self-immolation is very much there. But yeah, but also just to highlight how political the harga is, and how the harga was part of the revolution as well, enormously. So in the first 6 months of 2011, over 30,000 Tunisians have been recorded to have arrived in Lampedusa. Yeah, and yes, so the experience of the revolution is the experience of the harga as well, very much, and very much in places like Zarzis. So thinking the revolution through the harga and the harga through revolution seemed very interesting. And it's by no means something that I'm doing by myself. I'm also building on the work of a ton of other scholars like Martina Tazzioli and Federica Sossi, like Caterina Drusa, like a ton of others who've also written about, like Mehdi Mabrouk as well, whom I cited. Yeah.
Hi, Valentina, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ian, who asked that question via Camilla there. And hi, thanks for talking. Interesting perspective. And I'm, meeting you here from. I'm in Northern England, in Yorkshire, and I work with refugees who, a lot of them spend up to 2-3 years in a state of restricted social interaction. They're not allowed to work. They're on a minimal amount of money. They're in a desperate, destitute situation once they get here. And I'm wondering how much of that experience of having got across the border, having arrived in Europe, how much of that experience, having overcome that moment of burning, and not dying, and yet then arriving in another social death. The existence of the asylum-seeking refugees in Europe is just another social death, in a sense. We've got this thing called the hostile environment. How much of that feeds back to the people who are in that position of thinking of making the journey?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
No, I just wonder, do people come back and say, don't go? It's worse once you get over that. If you live, if you survive, the experience of applying for status in Europe is so horrible. You really got to stay and make the revolution where we are, where you know what I mean? Does that happen, or do people are people just still, escaping?
I mean, there's definitely a whole host of people who refuse engaging in the harga, and that's also a kind of very political choice, or who come back and are very adamant about telling people that France is terrible, Europe is terrible. There are definitely people like that, but generally, Tunisians who arrive to Lampedusa and Sicily, very few ask for asylum because for various reasons. The main reason is that Italy and Tunisia have bilateral agreements whereby people apprehended in Tunisia, in Sicily and Lampedusa get repatriated almost immediately, which doesn't give them the time to properly ask for asylum and decide how they want to proceed legally in the country. And this is something that that is hugely problematic, and that organizations such as Lawyers Without Borders in Tunisia, but also ASGI in Italy, have been working for and denouncing for a long period of time. It's the country, Tunisia, that Italy repatriates people to immediately. They have something like 3 flights a week over the summer. So that makes it very hard for people to ask for asylum, but also even if they were to ask for asylum, it's really quite rare for Tunisians to be granted asylum. Even during the revolutionary period, very, very few people were granted refugee status. And right now, they just wouldn't be considered. It would be difficult for people to get asylum. So most people who arrive either manage to escape detention centers or managed to arrive undetected. There's also these cases because from Tunisia, it's much smaller boats often that leave, of sort of 15 people maximum, that don't necessarily get apprehended always by the Italian Coast Guard or by Frontex. Although having said that, this summer, Tunisian military boats have been deployed even in Italian waters and in international waters to bring Tunisians back. So there is the developments of what's happening in the central Mediterranean are ever evolving and becoming ever more shut off, and involving North African countries ever more in bringing people back to North Africa. But yeah, absolutely, and I think you're definitely right in asking me to think a bit deeper about the social death that occurs and the sort of undignified situation of people on the other side in France. So I was able to follow several especially young men, but also a family of people who went over during the time of my fieldwork and afterwards. And even if they are, I mean, they're not allowed to work, they're sans papier, but the social death that they're in is definitely real. They haven't described it as such to me, but I think most people know that once you're in France, your life is going to be work incredibly hard, and it's going to be unpleasant. You're going to have to try and not get apprehended by the police, and just make do. But nevertheless, something that remains, I think, a sort of kind of reality for a lot of people is that you'd be doing the same kind of work in Tunisia or say France, but in France you might be paid €1,000 or €1,500, and in Tunisia that's more than a minister earns. That's like a huge salary. So it's
is there a you know, kind of, are people actually succeeding in France and sending remittances back home? Is there an actual viable economic flow going on?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so
yes.
It's working. It's a viable model. It's worth the risk, in a sense.
I mean, yeah. I don't know if it's a model, but it's definitely for a lot of people. It's just a no-brainer. Why would you do the same difficult, disheartening, back-breaking job to be paid 3 times less and stay in Tunisia? But yeah, but there's no illusion. There's definitely no, that's also another big myth, that young men think it's El Dorado. Young men don't think it's El Dorado. Young men know that it's terrible, like mostly, like at least in Zarzis, where so many families have so many people working in France, even if you do have a French passport or you have residency status, it's tough. So there's no illusions. I don't think people go out there with huge expectations, but one expectation that is met is the fact that when you send money home, it triples. So whatever you send home is already important.
Right.
Anymore. Lex, did you want to come in again?
Could I just, yeah, so sorry, just going on this point, you know, and going on what Ian was saying. So in fact, it's quite interesting that, you know, of course, if you send money home, the cost of living is so much higher in France and it's, you know, wherever. So in fact, it's not just your dignity, but actually the dignity of your family that you're looking after. Where to a point you go through the harga, and if you are lucky and you are successful, it's kind of an enlarged sort of benefit that comes in. So you're actually fulfilling the dignity of people back home, not just yours. I think this is really, you know, this is really interesting. But again, this is stuff that is not ever, you know, well, it's not told enough. I mean, in the UK, it's not, you know, this whole rhetoric of you know, that people decide to be on benefits because, you know, they have a choice and they are better off, you know, all this, the whole rhetoric around poverty, of course, is terrible. But I like, you know, sorry, I like it's the wrong term. It's really interesting that this, you know, when we're talking about dignity, that actually you start also putting the dignity of your family back home on the agenda. Yeah, so I thought that was an interesting point. And the other thing that I very much like in this is sort of changing the language. One of the things that struck me the most about your talk is how twice or maybe 3 times you said, you know, the victims of the European border regimes, because this is what they are. Let's call a spade a spade. This is what they are. And as a personal experience, after Brexit, I started really thinking about, you know, I always called myself an immigrant, but even more. And also the idea of a diaspora. For example, in the early 90s, when I moved here as a 20-year-old, there were a lot of youngsters leaving the area where I came from, although it wasn't a poor area, it was just kind of, you know, and suddenly starting to think about a diaspora, you know, because then there is a loss of talent, a loss of, you know, of things, and starting to use the correct language for our experience and for the experience of ours, then starts to change perspectives. And if it changes our perspective, then slowly it can possibly start changing everybody's perspective. Although I'm not holding any hope very soon, but this is the work that, you know, language is a really, really powerful tool, I think. And I'm very grateful for the fact that you use that expression, you know, the victims of, you know, the European border regime, because this is what it is. So yeah, anyway, that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lieta. Yeah, absolutely. And yes, and that's definitely also about your first point. That's definitely what I tried to also foreground in the ethnography. So it's very much stories, not of individuals, because then this is the other somewhat issue in a lot of both NGO and policy-driven research, but also academic research that doesn't involve long-term fieldwork, which is that people tend to just focus on the border crossers, so on the harga. So there's a lot of literature, for example, on the young men and how they cross, how they get to Europe, how they live in Europe, which is obviously important, but then it sort of ends up as if these young men exist in a vacuum, whereby again you reproduce this idea that it's individual choices and the men willing things into existence, and
but that's easier to manage.
Exactly, but it's
that's easier to manage, so you don't have to, you know, it's this horrible single individuals that you can pick out of the, you know, if they make it to Lampedusa, you can pick them one by one, you can shut them up, whatever, and then you don't have to deal with the all the, you know, the situation around.
Exactly, and it also makes the families and the lives that they're connected to disappear completely, and so seem unimaginable, and so then they can be very easily dehumanized because they're just young men, skillless, dangerous, rapists, whatever, like you can throw anything on them because they're out of context completely. They're these young men coming over here invading. And same with border deaths, people just become numbers without families. So one border death is a huge amount of people who are affected. It's not just one death, it's a loss. Yeah, so I think it's absolutely crucial to yeah, absolutely what you said, to just link it back to the fact that dignity cannot exist. We cannot be dignified alone. The dignity wouldn't exist. We can only become dignified through interactions and through relationships. And that's where it matters what policies impinge on our dignity as well.
Such a powerful point.
Yes, yeah, you're giving us the impression of all those families behind who, as you say, mothers selling jewelry to support sons going for the harga, and obviously these networks are multiplying. But I wondered if you could also say just a little more about the visa weddings. So that's a different strategy whereby there may be marriage to the older women retirees, is that right? And whether that's something that's happening, is that happening kind of as even more?
Yeah, I couldn't fit the French retirees in this piece.
No, I'm sure not. But even if a little bit of that maybe puts in perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Camilla, for asking about them, because then this is the other thing that I sort of felt was important in this thesis, to try and bring in different migratory trajectories too. And so definitely a thing that Tunisia has been trying to do for a while now is make it easier and easier and getting rid of as many taxes as possible for European pensioners to come over here and settle. So there's all sorts of private clinics that are being set up for elderly care, and Hammamet is full of Italians. who are there, who retired. Zarzis and Jerba are more Francophone, but there's also Dutch and Germans and all sorts of people who, again, would have a very undignified elderly life in Europe because their pensions are often quite small. But in Tunisia, suddenly they become incredible pensions. So I'm also trying to bring in their stories of what a dignified life is, and the fact that actually Zarzis for them is a kind of is a kind of incredible place for living out your retirement with dignity, but also all the kind of problematic aspects that this entails. And yeah, and visa weddings are for sure another way in which people can have access to the EU. Yeah, and yes, I try to sort of give a story of some of these couples, which some of which haven't lasted very long, and they often involve a much younger Tunisian man and an older European woman, but not always. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I just stopped talking. Maybe it's a bit awkward.
I'm so sorry. I just got cut. My connection cut off. I heard half of the story about the pensioners from Europe coming and trying to claim their own dignified life. Yes, but yeah, I think we probably better see if there's any further questions, and then maybe decide that we've kept you long enough. For Valentina, thank you. It's been a really wonderful talk, and just incredibly illuminating and helpful for us here with our perspective. And just so moving, fascinating to hear about your extraordinary theatre experimental ethnography as well. I'm really interested in that. And yeah, we just have to say thank you so much for this wonderful work. I think everybody's been just founded an extraordinary piece of work. And yeah, so thank you so much. I'm just going to repeat again, thanks to all the participants, just going to repeat again that next week we are going back into the class at UCL, and I'm going to do a talk on African women's customary traditions of rebellion and the meanings of undress. So it's going to be focused very much on so-called naked protest on African traditions. Yeah, that will be both on the Zoom channel. So Zoom people, you'll be fine, but we'll also be live. If you can make it live and you're happy to take the risk, then please do. But yeah, thank you so much today, Valentina, for all that. That's been really great.
Thank you so much. Thank you, really. Thank you also for staying for so long and for your patience with this very long reading. Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh no, it's been just fine. It was just the perfect length. Just perfect.
Okay, everybody.
Thank you.